Bill is practicing for praise band, so he can't be here to introduce Carissa, but we're glad to have her here. She is with Exodus World Service, one of our newer mission partners. And we heard a little bit from Exodus about a year ago, I think, but we are going to hear more today. So I'm not going to steal her thunder. This is Carissa Zafiro from Exodus World Service. I said your name right?
Yes, absolutely. Zafiro Italian. Italian immigrant family tradition. We're so happy to be here. I think Exodus was here about a year ago. And then at the end of summer this past year, we did a pen and paper simulation. Were any of you there for that? Okay, so my colleague facilitated it, but she said that it was really powerful here. Some of the reflections that happened. So I know that you guys have had that experience of kind of going through what the refugee experience feels like. And we do that program just to kind of build that personal connection and empathy. So today I want to switch gears a little bit in the adult Sunday school hour to think more about what it means for us to show hospitality as Christians, a little bit about the refugee crisis today, because it changes all the time. And then practically how we can welcome refugees in Chicagoland and about that Chicagoland population as well. And then hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions as well. But I want this morning to feel a little bit interactive, so I'm going to start with a question. What is a time that you've been shown hospitality? And if you have, and so hospitality in this case could be, you know, maybe a friend that made space for you when you were feeling really down and they let you share, and they made you a cup of tea, or it could be a really nice, fancy 10-course meal that you went to, and it was amazing hospitality and you felt led through the evening, or maybe something you experienced in another country. So for a couple minutes, why don't you turn to a neighbor or friend? People on Google Meet, you can put it in the chat so maybe you can see each other's. What is a time that you've been shown hospitality?
When she said,
Nancy Nichols, so I didn't know anybody. This was just talking, not knowing anybody. She was. Just coming back. She introduced herself, I introduced myself.
So I went up, I should have been
Church.
crashed with my bike.
Oh, it's insane. Very. Yeah, she was. Got me on the first assigned list, got me, you know, interviewed. So you got something. That's right here. We were like, you'll be 2 years on the board. Did you come from another country? Yes.
Friends of mine, weren't going home either.
Yeah, so then I knew about this church. I had come occasionally for special services. I knew it, and more dark clothes that was hoped, right? So I watched your services on. Felt very comfortable. No, my
I'm just trying to think of what a good example.
Where do you live?
Okay, we'll wrap it up in about 20 seconds.
And they were
And then there's just, there's plenty of grace.
and then we went to another.
You guys are making us little virtually.
Yeah. It was just.
All right, I hate to cut off conversations, but we'll bring it in. That seems like a really rich time. Could I have maybe 2 people share their experience of a time that they were shown hospitality with the group, or a time that they experienced hospitality, just in a couple sentences? 2 people maybe could share.
I'll be glad
Yeah.
to, because I'm fairly new member at this church. I said in June it will be 2 years I'm coming, and from the first Sunday when I came to the second Sunday, how I was greeted and welcomed and remembered and introduced. So there's a lot of hospitality right here in this building.
Yeah, it's beautiful to hear.
We went to my sister's for dinner, and she's single, she's a pretty small apartment, and there were a lot of people that were there, surprisingly. And then two of my brothers flew in from out of town and said, somebody's here at the door who wants to know if they can come and eat with us. And she had already prepared a lot, and she's like, whoever it is, let them in. And we said, no, they want to talk to you. And she came in, it was my two brothers who she didn't expect. But she, no matter who it was, she would have welcomed them. But then the fact that it was my brothers, even more. But she blinked an eye, and it's like, and it was a lot for her to make for,
Yes.
10 of us or whatever it was.
Wow, I love that. Those are two great examples. Thank you guys for sharing. So now I want to look at a moment of hospitality in scripture. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Genesis 18, but I also have it on the slides. Okay, great. So in Genesis 18, we are finding Abraham and Sarah desperately wants to have a child. You guys have all probably read this story. She's barren. This is a passage we've read before, but I want to try and read it here with the lens of hospitality. So you guys can open. We're going to be in Genesis 18, 1 through 10. And I'll put the slides on the screen as well. Genesis 18, 1 through 10. Someone can yell out the page number if we're not already there. 13. Okay, so the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favors in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under the tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to his servant, who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and sat these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There, in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Okay, so I want to hear some of your reflections as you think through a lens of hospitality. What are some of the things that you noticed reading this passage?
Humility.
They must have been there a long time, because how long does it take to prepare a cow?
Yes, that's definitely one of the things I noticed too. This day start to finish, especially I read too at the beginning in the heat of the day. That might not have been fun work either. So humility, a long time, it was probably costly for them, the amount of time.
I noticed that all they asked for was some water and to have their feet washed. And he went all out with the bread and the calves and the whole meal.
Yes, it was abundant hospitality. He went above and beyond.
And he,
So his first reaction is he bowed down to them,
Hmm.
kind of really showing them respect without even knowing who they were.
Yeah, a lot of honor there.
And he hurried to meet them. He ran out to them even before they approached him.
Yeah.
And whenever you see this scene depicted, he's kind of out in the middle of nowhere.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So he's a stranger. Pretty thrilling.
Yes, yeah, and also recognizing that the strangers might have been on a long journey with no meals or no water or anything like that too, not knowing where their next stop is. Yeah, so those are amazing reflections. I also think of those things when I read this passage, just how costly that hospitality might have been, even based on, having a herd of cattle being your livelihood, and then for strangers that you don't even know, just slaughtering one of those calves and serving it to them, that can be costly. But something else that I see in this passage too is that God meets Sarah and Abraham's deepest desire in the midst of their hospitality. As they're serving, as they're rolling out the red carpet, this one thing that they desired more than anything, to have a child, God meets them in that place and he grants that to them as well. And I think that's something that we experience during hospitality, and something that I've experienced in my own life as well, is that as I'm extending hospitality to others, that I actually feel greeted by the Lord in the midst of that. And the author of Hebrews kind of affirms this when he says, show hospitality to strangers, for by doing some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. And then Jesus Christ takes this one step further when he says, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And this is a time that I reflect on, especially after this Christmas time, that Jesus really knew what it was like to be a stranger in a foreign land. So he was born in a place that wasn't his parents' home. He was in Bethlehem for the census. But then, because of Herod, the autocratic ruler who was threatened by him and wanted to kill him, he had to flee his home in the middle of the night, which is an experience that many refugees today have, and one that maybe you reflected on if you were here for the pen and paper simulation. What it might mean to leave your home suddenly in the middle of the night. And then Jesus and his family found themselves in a foreign land in Egypt. They probably didn't know the language. They might not have known who was going to take them in. If they were on a long journey, who was going to give them something to drink or something to eat, or take them into their home while they found something else. And so I think Jesus has some personal experience and some empathy when I hear him share this. Whoever gave you something to drink or eat, it's as if you did it for me, because Jesus in his formative years knows what that feels like. And then here his ministry is marked by serving and thinking of those marginalized populations who might not be cared for by the dominant culture in his time. And so he says here that actually when you do that for someone that might not even be on your radar, someone who's so marginalized, it's as if you're doing it for me. You're welcoming the divine in that moment. And so I've experienced some of my most beautiful moment of welcome that is similar to maybe the culture of Jesus's time. I was able to study abroad in the Middle East when I was in school. And I was studying under a missionary who had been in the region for quite a long time, 20 or 30 years, I mean. And he had made really great friends with a sheikh in that region. And so a sheikh is kind of a community leader of a tribe in that region. It's kind of based out of a tribalistic society. And so they invited me and my study cohorts over for dinner one night. And they wanted to make for us the traditional dish, which was mansaf, which is a lamb dish that has to be cooked in milk for hours and hours. So they invited us over, they slaughtered the sheep, they cooked the lamb, and we were there for hours and hours. And then finally they served us on these big platters. We sat on the ground and we ate communally, and we were there. And then after we ate, there was singing and dancing and music, and we had this amazing experience. And I felt personally blessed by that. But also while I was in Jordan, I was working with Iraqi refugees. So that is where I first came across the refugee crisis, and where I began to learn about refugees, and where I started to see that my friends' stories reflected so much the story of Christ in the Bible. And of course, the word refugee is not used in the scriptures. That word wasn't around back in the ancient Near East, but it is a word that we have now. And this is the definition of refugee that was adopted by the US government in 1980. And it says that a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave his or her homeland and is unable to return home because she or he has experienced persecution or has a well-founded fear of persecution. And persecution can be based on these 5 things. So when you're gaining refugee status, you have to prove one of these 5 things. And that can be persecution related to race, nationality, religion, political opinions, or membership in a particular social group. So also what we like to do is update you on where the refugee crisis is at right now. And so the number that we last received from the UNHCR is that there are 27.1 million refugees in the world today. That means we are in the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, but also this is the number that we received before the war in Ukraine began. So you can actually imagine that that number has only increased exponentially. And one of the reasons that that number is so large is because less than 1% of refugees are resettled annually, making it so that the average time refugees spend waiting to be resettled to a third country is about 17 years. So refugees spend an unimaginable time waiting. And when I was in Jordan, the stories I was hearing from my Iraqi friends, they were Christians in Mosul. So they were telling stories of ISIS marching into their home country and having to flee over the border. And their lives were just stalled. They had been there for years. They couldn't work jobs. A lot of them were way more educated than me. They were engineers and architects, teachers. They had their masters and their PhDs, and they couldn't do anything. And were just hoping for resettlement. But when many refugees are being resettled, they are coming right here to Chicagoland. And so at Exodus, we believe that we have a responsibility and a call to welcome refugees who are coming to our community, just as we would welcome. And so when I moved, I'll stop here. When I first moved to Chicago after my formative experiences of meeting refugees in the Middle East, I felt like I had this biblical call and responsibility to welcome refugees. So I moved specifically to Chicago's North Side because I knew that there was a refugee population there. But once I got there, I realized that living somewhere does not automatically equate to just flourishing mutual natural relationship with someone. If you've ever moved to a new place, you probably know that this is true. So I was living in Chicago for about a year before I happened to ask a friend what she was doing that day. And she said that she was going on a bike ride with her friend from the Central African Republic. And they went on these adventures around the city every week, and they had been friends for about 7 or 8 months. And I asked how this was even possible, and she told me about Exodus. So that's where I learned about Exodus, first as a volunteer. And I learned that the mission of Exodus is to educate churches about the plight of refugees, to connect volunteers with refugees through practical service projects, and to empower others to be champions for refugees. So in short, Exodus was the bridge that I was looking for me to be able to serve the refugee population in Chicago and to be able to continue to learn about this population and then connect and serve in meaningful ways that were mutual and beneficial. And so I want to be able to tell you guys about some of those ways as well, and then open it up for a time of a bit of question and response. And in some ways, you, particularly as a church and as a partner, are already doing this. So many of you have participated or contributed to our Welcome to America PAC program, where we collect all the items that refugees need in a new home. So a lot of the things in our house we take for granted, but when refugees flee their home, they might not be able to take, pots and pans with them, or envelopes and stamps. And these are all the things that we're providing in a refugee's home when they first arrive, and something that Parkhurst Presbyterian has provided as well. We have 2 other PAC programs in addition to that. Our baby care pack is essentially all those items you would receive at a baby shower. It's a little bit smaller, so this is great for an adult Sunday school class or a women's group or a men's group. And then the last is our ethnic grocery care pack. So you can imagine when you first arrive somewhere, you don't know where the closest grocery store is, much less one that is going to serve food that feels like home and that you can actually cook with. So it's providing about a week's worth of groceries to a family in culturally familiar foods. But I can tell you that this program is amazing. And when you go to greet a family, hopefully you're able to greet them just as they've come to the airport. And you're one of the first people to say, "Welcome to America. We're so happy that you're here." But when refugees first arrive, their troubles don't end there. As you can imagine, the stories that we hear from refugees is that it's just a new host of challenges that arise. It's, where are my kids going to go to school? How am I going to find a job? How do I take public transportation? The public library, all these things. And in some ways, many people are asking, as we all do, am I on my own now? Who's going to be walking beside me? What is my community here? Especially the refugees coming from these communal cultures, that's really important. They've left communities behind, not just homes. So that's why Exodus developed our New Neighbor program. And it's a program that allows us to walk alongside refugees as they resettle and as they build new lives. And each of these programs focus specifically on something that might be a barrier to belonging. So if you don't know the language, you might not feel like you can integrate into the community. That's our New Neighbor Conversations program. Refugees go through 3 months of ESL when they first arrive here. But if you've ever tried to learn a new language before, you know sometimes you just need that one-on-one support. We hope as you have a conversation, as you practice language acquisition, you're also just building a friendship and a relationship. As we talked about, refugees can spend years waiting to be resettled. We don't know what education looks like for children during that years of waiting. Some established refugee camps will have school systems. Some will have humanitarian workers who come in for remedial school lessons. But many refugees are without normal education for the years that they're waiting. And then when they're resettled, they typically just get put into public school where we don't actually know what kind of support that they'll always have. So many refugee students need a lot of help when they first arrive. So that's our New Neighbor for Youth program, where you'd be matched with a refugee elementary or middle school student. And I can tell you that this program is our biggest need. So I don't know where you guys are coming from as far as from the church, but mainly the 2 main populations of refugees are on the north side of the city. There's a housing shortage, so kind of spread out around the city, but typically on the north side. And then in the western suburbs as well, specifically in DuPage County around Wheaton, Glen Ellen, Downers Grove, and again, spread out a little bit. And even just in DuPage County, we have about 50 students waiting for tutors on our New Neighbor for Youth list. And in the city, we have about 25 students. So this is a really big need to tutor these students, but it's also mentoring them, and it's providing support for the whole family as well. When refugees first arrive, again, there's a lot of needs. So our New Neighbor program is just matching you with someone who has just arrived. So I can say that on Thursday, I had one of the most formational matches that I've had in this program. It was a woman who just arrived from Afghanistan while she was in Pakistan and then Albania, and then came to the US, and she had also recently got out of prison for protesting the Taliban with a group of women. And I was able to match her with my friend Emily, and she was saying I'm in my home all the time here. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. I need to practice English. I need a friend. I want a community. And I was able to match her with a friend who was saying, yeah, we'll go to the library. We'll practice English. We'll take walks. We'll go on runs. Let's learn to ride a bike. And it was so fun to watch them both light up and say, like, yes, we can't wait to be friends and we can't wait to explore the city together. So that's what our New Neighbor program is about. There's a lot of loneliness when refugees are first resettled, and it helps alleviate some of that. Our last program, at the 5-year mark, refugees are eligible to apply to take the U.S. citizenship exam and become naturalized as U.S. citizens. So I think a lot of us couldn't even pass that exam, but we give you all the materials that you need to be able to study with someone, and there's both a written and oral component of that. So it's practicing some English as well, and then we all celebrate when they pass. So I personally have been so blessed in this program. About 80% of our staff actually serves as new neighbors as well, because a lot of us started as volunteers. I personally was matched with my new neighbors from Afghanistan back in November, and my birthday is in December. And so December, I was matched with them. It's been over a year now. And after about 3 weeks of knowing me, they somehow found out that it was my birthday. And after 3 weeks, they told me to come to their apartment because they needed something. I thought, it was some kind of medical emergency. I walked in and they had thrown me this huge surprise birthday party. And they barely knew the neighborhood, but they had walked like 40 minutes to buy a cake. And my name was spelled wrong on it. And they had prepared this whole feast. And I walked in and was nearly moved to tears. I think it was the most hospitality that I've ever received, especially for someone who barely knew me, which really reminds me again of the scripture that we read at the beginning, the kind of hospitality that our volunteers are shown in these programs, typically by a culture that understands hospitality really well. We find that our volunteers are so touched and so moved. And at the same time, by inviting someone into our community and into our culture, we're able to extend hospitality as well. And so there's just this mutual blessing that happens in these programs. And it's something very beautiful to be a part of. It also allows us the ability to understand more deeply who refugees are. So when we hear in the news things happening with the Afghan Adjustment Act, or we see, the footage of the war in Ukraine, it changes things when we know that those individuals are in our communities and we go and visit their homes, and we have faces and specific stories and names to put with them and relationships that we've built. So it just allows us to understand the refugee crisis in a deeper and more colorful and full way. And then also there's so much joy. When my new neighbors first arrived here, they didn't know English at all. I mean, we worked just with Google Translate, and now we don't use it at all. It's been a little over a year and their English is nearly fluent. And it's such a joy to see them having come here with so little, and you'll just find that refugees are so resilient, and seeing them rebuild their lives and getting to have been a part of that is something that's really powerful and changes someone and also changes a family, and is, a beautiful way to fulfill that call in Matthew 25 to welcome the stranger. And I do like to end also a time by showing you or telling the narrative of a refugee herself. And I don't know if this video will play with the sound that we've got rigged up, but let me see. It might just play the sound off my laptop.
My refugee journey was really hard for me, for my family. We left Syria because of the war, because our home in Syria destroyed. We came from Syria to Jordan walking. I was 8 years old. we stayed in Jordan for 5 years. I didn't feel like we are welcome in Jordan. We faced a lot of racism. Imagine yourself, you are in a new country and you don't know what is in this country, and you don't know what's the language in this country, and it's hard to you to communicate or to understand people. So you're gonna feel confused, you're gonna feel depressed, you're gonna feel every bad feeling in the world. All of this and the people not welcomed you, it's really hard. Everything changed when I came here. When I came here, I felt that that's the country I belong to. And when I saw Gail and the people from the church and the way that they welcomed us, I felt I'm home again. After Gail, Brenda came. My impression with Brenda is the best ever. When I saw her for the first time, she's so friendly and kind. So after that, we always hang out. She showed me almost all Chicago, and she loves my family. Always, my mom makes food for her, and she loved it. She said, "This is the best food ever, but don't tell my mom." When we came here, when I saw how American people very welcome, very very nice. They are really nice people. For the first time in my life after the Syria war, I felt like in this land people appreciate you. I love school now. I made friends. I enjoy my time. I have straight A every time, all the time. I built all my dream in this country. Since I in the United States, that's enough to give me hope to complete my future and reach my dreams. I know I will reach them. Because of them, I felt there is somebody beside me to help me, to support me. Because of them, I felt I'm not alone.
I always get chills when I hear Ula's story. One thing I love about this story too is that I see the power of the church. So Gail and Rick Benedetto are two volunteers who do Welcome to America packs. And so I love that they were able to welcome Ula and her family on the first day they arrived. And then Brenda Queller is a new neighbor who's been with Ula for, I think, over a year to 2 years. And they just have this beautiful friendship. And I love that the church was able to come around Ula and make her feel like this is a country where she is welcome and belongs and can build her dreams and her hopes here. And I also see this has changed the volunteers as well. So even just Brenda, she's also a professor at Moody Bible Institute. And now she brings Exodus representatives into all of her classes and teaches about refugees every year to her students as well. And she's wanting to teach the next generation this. So I've seen it change so many lives of refugees and volunteers. And seeing that as we extend hospitality and a place to belong, we also feel that ourselves as well. So I want to open up some time for questions. I know one thing I didn't answer, which I'll say here, is just the populations that are coming into Chicago. This past year, we welcomed an incredible amount of Afghan refugees. We're still doing that, although now it's being opened up to more ethnicities as well. We've had some Ukrainian refugees, although we expect to see more in the future. And then we're also welcoming refugees from South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea. I'm starting to see some from Central and South American countries like Colombia, Venezuela, Guatemala. And then, yeah, South Sudan, Syria, those are our top ones. Yeah, so that's mainly the population we see. Oh, and then Burma, Myanmar. So especially in DuPage County, that's our largest population. And then in the city, I mean, you can imagine Chicago is so diverse. So usually refugees are resettled where there's a strong ethnic population, and Chicago has every population. So we really get the full gambit of refugees that are resettled here. So I want to open it up for questions and reflections, and I think we have about 10 minutes left. I know that this is a big topic, so.
So what was the total number of refugees that you welcomed, say, last year?
Yeah, I have, so I can put some things out and yeah, I can hand some things around. You guys want to kind of take one of these and pass it along. These are some response cards. And then some of our numbers for this last year. So let me find that number for you, Bill. I think it was something like
11,807.
Something like.
okay, I would say like maybe more accurate is welcomed is probably more the 8,000 number. So it was a really big year for us again because of the Afghan crisis. So we hit our peak last year. We did 10 Welcome to America packs in one day. And I'll also say internally that it was the day before Thanksgiving. So it was crazy. So yeah, this past year was an all hands on deck situation. Every year we do receive the presidential determination on refugees who are able to be resettled, the cap. And this year, this fiscal year, that cap is 125,000. So up to that many refugees can be resettled. Chicago, because of its capacity and diversity, receives 7 to 8% of that number annually. So we've been told that the refugee resettlement program is expanding and growing. They're hoping to resettle more. So we are hoping and expecting, trying to build capacity to see this number grow even more for this coming year. Typically, the actual number of refugees coming in isn't close to that 125,000 number because of COVID and other things. But yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, do you partner with people that provide jobs for refugees?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Exodus partners with 5 to 6 of the major resettlement agencies in Chicago. So they refer us their cases. It's a really symbiotic relationship. And the resettlement agency works on job placement with refugees in the first 90 days that they're here. But we're also always kind of keeping our ear to the ground for job opportunities for refugees. Just because usually they're placed at like O'Hare Airport or like meat packing plants, some jobs that aren't like amazing. So if we have an opportunity for, if that's what you're saying, you have a job opportunity, we will definitely, yeah, we can connect.
Along those same lines, so if you think about the refugees that come in,
Mhm.
and you touched on when you were in Jordan, that you met engineers, architects. So what's your sense of the percentage of very highly educated refugees that come to Chicago, and I assume many of them end up working at O'Hare or as cab drivers or whatever. So how many of them are really ought to be in professional positions and aren't able to get there?
Yeah, it's really hard. I even read an article recently, Bill, that I can send you. I forget the term exactly, but it was something like intellectual waste. Basically, especially with the Afghan crisis, these were individuals that were helping the US government. And so they were really trained professionals, whether they were translators or videographers or working in US embassies. And now they're here and they're kind of starting at square one. So, gosh, I mean, I would say especially of Afghans, nearly all of them. And then other refugees, I wouldn't be able to give a percentage, but yeah, a good portion. I will say there's a couple organizations that are just trying specifically to work on that issue. So there's one called like Upwardly Global, I think, and they help refugees get similar accreditations or vouch for their expertise to try and get them in similar fields that they were, but it's really difficult. Yeah. Even this woman I was talking about on Thursday, she studied political science and law, and now they're telling her she has to get her GED. So,
So I'm sorry, I missed the first part, but I'm assuming there's an actual
category of refugee that the government gives people, right? So I'm just wondering about the many people at the southern border, Mexican border, some of whom are fleeing persecution. But I guess my statement and my question is, if they're not classified as a refugee, they're outside of the scope of your organization?
Yeah, that's a great question and one I would love to talk about. So people who get refugee status, they're actually gaining that status when they've crossed their country's border into a second country where they're given refugee status, and then they're waiting to be resettled to a third country. So a country like the US would welcome them to come resettle here, and they're legally under refugee status from the first day they arrive. Because while they're in that second country, they've been able to prove persecution or well-founded fear of persecution. Those who are being persecuted in their home countries, who then come up through the southern border, they're crossing over the border and then coming to the US, where they are claiming persecution or well-founded fear of persecution, and then they would be called asylum seekers. So they are seeking to stay in the second country that they cross into. So those are asylees, and those are a population that, we're not working with. But things are changing like pretty rapidly within even the past 2 weeks. And the Biden administration extending what's called a humanitarian parolee process to Venezuelans and now Nicaraguans and Haitians and Cubans who are applying for parolee status in their home countries and then being resettled to the US, and they are coming to Chicago. So we are starting to serve those populations who go through the humanitarian parolee process, but not the asylee process. It's really complicated.
Yes, thank you.
So you said 17 years takes them to become citizens. What's the biggest hurdle there?
Yeah, so 17 years is the average time refugees can spend waiting. Once refugees are here, it's about 5 years till they can become citizens. But the biggest hurdle is just that 1% number that so few refugees are resettled annually. Part of that is because the number of refugees being welcomed. For example, I think the US actually only resettled 15,000 refugees this past year. So that doesn't make a dent in that 27.1 million number. The other thing is that unfortunately, some refugees are never resettled. So either they don't have the correct documentation or they just live out the rest of their lives in a camp. So that makes that number longer as well. Of course, sometimes we do see refugees resettled in, 5 years. But even the like biodata checking time and security screening, health screening, that takes about 2.5 years. So it's just a long process.
Did I understand that right? Because earlier you had said that the number that's allowed is 125,000, but we only let in 15,000?
Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Yeah, so part of that is capacity too, for where we're at right now. So the previous administration had put that cap at 15,000. So that's where the cap was. And so that's where the capacity was. So like resettlement agencies had been gutted. Those programs, those employees, the whole resettlement program had really been gutted. So we're trying to build up capacity, and then the pandemic hit. So it's just been a hard past couple of years for resettlement. And then I believe I'll have to look, but I don't think that 15,000 number includes the Afghans because they technically came here on that parolee status, not through the traditional refugee resettlement program. And so really, I think the US, it doesn't include that number because the US brought in about 75,000 Afghan parolees. So they were on special immigrant visas.
More Afghans than anyone else then.
Definitely.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So it says Exodus World Service.
Mhm.
Is that implies that there's other countries with an Exodus presence that's doing the work you're doing here?
That's a good question.
How do we stack up in terms of how many folks we take in compared to the rest of the network of Exodus locations?
Yeah, so it's funny. Exodus World Service is our name. We are just local in Chicagoland.
Okay.
So we do have an overseas program, a global neighbor program, but other than that, we are just in the Chicagoland area. The US is in the top 5 resettling countries in the world, but we are not the top. I think the top is like Germany and Turkey. Canada's in there somewhere. I can find out for you.
Is that top 5 based on absolute numbers or in percentage of population?
Absolute numbers. Yeah.
I would think in terms of population, we're probably far down the list.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Well, another question I had that I wanted to pose was that, you're right in, we have so many different ethnic communities in Chicago. It's a great place for people to come and be near, their countrymen, right? People that come from their country of origin. You reach out to any of the other smaller cities and communities around the region to place people? And if so, what's the reception that they receive in those places?
In other cities around the US?
Well, like Peoria, Bloomington, Champaign, just around the region.
Oh, in Illinois.
Yeah.
Yeah, so sometimes there are resettlement agencies. I know in Aurora, I think there's one in Peoria. I could look into it for you, but sometimes a city will just focus on maybe one population rather than the diversity that Chicago has. So I know I went to school around Indianapolis and they just have a huge Burmese population. So in a smaller city, that's often what you'll find. There'll just be one large population of refugees.
But you're not placing people in those locations. Your scope is focused on Chicago.
Yeah, our scope is focused on Chicago, and Exodus was founded specifically to fill some of the relational gaps that we saw in the resettlement process. So our founders 35 years ago worked at resettlement agencies, and they saw that these aid workers were incredible, and that because the government requires them as social workers and caseworkers to fill and check specific boxes, they weren't able to do a lot of the things they wanted to do, which was not just get refugees on food stamps, for example, but actually like go to the grocery store and cook a meal with them and sit around a table. And they realized that that's really what refugees were also looking for. And so Exodus was founded to fill that social relational gap and connect the church with refugees to be able to provide that friendship and community support.
So where do you get your group of refugees? There are, you said 5 or 6 resettlement agencies. And do you get a list of everybody that comes through them? How do you get what refugees you're going to work with?
Yeah, nearly. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement will let a Chicago resettlement agency know, hey, we have a Syrian family of 4 coming in next week. And then the resettlement agency will let Exodus know, hey, we have a Syrian family of 4 coming in next week. Do you have a partner with a Welcome to America pack ready? Because the resettlement agency receives a little over $2,000 for every individual that comes in. In Chicago, you can imagine those funds don't go very far. So our Welcome to America pack list is items that are required by the US government to be in refugees' homes. So if we can actually kind of get the church to provide those items and give them the opportunity to show hospitality, the funds that the resettlement agency would have spent on those resources just gets refunneled back into services for refugees. So that's why I said it's a really symbiotic relationship. So we work hand in hand with the resettlement agencies. And then from there, when we're introduced to the refugees who are being resettled, we ask them if they want a volunteer to come and work with them. The majority of people say yes, they would love that. And then we can connect them with a new neighbor.
For the new neighbors, do you ever tap into the existing community like Syrians? Do you ever find a Syrian in a neighborhood that has an enclave that will act as a neighbor, so that kind of makes them feel a little bit more at home or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so when we do our new neighbor training, we talk about that a little bit more, just like our new neighbors role. So we just see ourselves as one pillar in addition to the ethnic community, which is a huge part, obviously. So we have technically people who are former refugees and who are of that ethnic population in our new neighbor program, and it's always amazing. Usually we find that those ethnic relationships form really naturally, and then we can also come alongside. There's so much power in being culturally familiar, and then there's also a lot of power in us being a cultural insider to American culture and just being able to help someone navigate that. One of my favorite stories recently was in October. My new neighbor, they looked something up and they showed me a picture on their phone, and it was a plastic skeleton. And they were like, "Why are these on people's yards now?" And their next question they typed into Google Translate was, "Is it safe to go outside?"
Yeah.
And I was like, "Okay, let me explain Halloween to you." So yeah, it's just like people often wonder in the new neighbor program, like, well, what do I have to offer to someone who is like protesting the Taliban in their home country? And it's just like, you can never overvalue just what it is to like know this country and this culture and to be able to help someone through that. So I think we're probably
About time.
yeah.
Let me close the word of prayer if we
I
can.
think so.
Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. We thank you for Carissa and for all of the staff and volunteers at Exodus World Service. We ask that you put on our hearts the needs of refugees around the world. Help us to recognize their plight and help us to gain understanding of what their needs might be. I ask that you be with us through the rest of today and the following weeks. And again, bless the work of all those who are serving you and welcoming the refugee and the stranger to their homes. I ask all these things in Jesus' name.